22 new farms are now possible since Minecraft just changed it so plants can grow without a player nearby. So I designed an automatic farm for each of them. Going from worst to best, let's see how each of them changes the game. Hello there, Ray here, and starting with last place is the weeping vines. You can find these in the nether, and even though they are vines that you can climb, there's not too much you can actually do with them. But like most plants, we can actually compost them down for bone meal, but their main use is probably for just decoration. Farming them is actually fairly easy. We just have a clock that is turning on a fly machine every once in a while. The biggest thing when it comes to these type of farms is just the amount of particles that are produced when the actual machine takes off. This does lower your frames, but this doesn't actually create a lag for the server because the server doesn't care about your actual frames for your computer. Rather, it just cares about how many entities are moving throughout the world. So generally, lag is not a problem. In 21st place is the twisting vine, which is a brother of the weeping vine. The main difference, which makes this one a little bit better than the weeping one, is that it grows from the ground up, which can be useful in designing certain types of farms where you use the vine to prevent entity cramming. But just like the other vines, you can also place them inside of composters for bone meal, but are probably mostly just used for decoration. The farm itself consists of a fly machine that comes through and will break them off, similar to my bamboo farm, and you only have to manage all the entities, which does make it a little bit more difficult since they get placed onto the floor. That means we have to come in with some hopper minecarts to pick them all up, rather than easily picking them up with just using some water. This also means we have to unload all the hopper minecarts and get all the items into storage. So due to their lack of uses, they rank very low. You'll notice that most of these farms are a similar length. This is so that the farms will fit inside of the spawn chunks, which are these 9 green chunks. And these are normally the only chunks that will process entities, such as picking up and collecting items without the player being nearby. And you can use a compass to find the center chunk of your spawn chunks. In 20th place is the newer item, which is the cactus flower. It looks a bit like the spore blossoms, except it is renewable and it can only be placed on the ground, but it does have a unique look that could work great for many builds. It can be composted for bone meal or crafted down into pink dye. It's also considered flower, so bees will use it, but it is quite expensive to farm up as we need to have a special machine here in order to harvest them. Cactus grow so slowly, you definitely wouldn't want to waste any of these flowers. But even though the farm doesn't produce too much per hour, it is a pretty simple farm with it being automated where the machine can come in and collect all the flowers with this little device, and the items are stored away. You can also load these farms without spawn chunks by using chunk loaders, either by having a soul sand with 6 water sources above it with a pearl bobbing in it, or by using my nether portal chunk loaders, which you can learn more about in this video here. Having one of these in each chunk that the farm is occupying will keep the chunks loaded even if you're far away. In 19th place is glowberries. Like the other vine plants we looked at before, they're mostly used for decoration, but they also can be climbed and they can be used for bone meal source. But unlike the previous vines we looked at, these can actually put off a light. The berries can also be ate by the player or used to breed foxes to get a trusted baby fox. Now farming them is pretty easy. Just like before, we can use a flying machine to come through and break them off, and some simple water in order to collect them and wash them into our storage system. And each of the farms have their own on and off switch, so as soon as the crops grow to their full length, it will not create any more strain on the game despite it being loaded. In 18th place is sweet berries. These are fairly easy to farm up. You do need to bring in a fox, which is a little bit of a hassle, but they are similar to the glowberries. You can breed foxes with them, use them in decorations, and bone meal them, and also eat them as a player. But unlike the previous ones, it's also useful in trading villagers for emeralds. Plus, most mobs will try to avoid going through it, so it's like a natural fence. But because farming them does take foxes, and we also need a hopper minecart to pick up all the loot that they drop off, it can be a little bit more complicated to farm these in large amounts. You can learn about each of these farms in more detail with their original videos, which are linked in the description. In 17th place is the pointed dripstone. And unlike most of them on this list, this is one of the few that's not actually a plant. But because they normally would get random tick in order to grow, these two can also now be grown inside of loaded chunks. But since they're not actual plants, you can't do most stuff with them, but one thing you can do is make these really cool dripstone blocks. as not only falling onto them will do extra damage, but they also have unique height sizes, which is useful for aligning entities. But they can be used in order to make a lava farm, which is a nice way to get tons of fuel. It can also be used in order to dry out mud to make a clay farm, which is also a separate farm that can technically run without a player, since mud drying is also a random tick now in any loaded chunks. But it's similar to other farms where it can easily be farmed up with a fly machine, and this will break them all off. They'll just fall down as falling block entities, and then they will turn to items and also get collected by the water stream. Once again, a fairly simple farm to get you tons of items. Next up is to click that like button on the video. In 16th place is the propagule farm, and it's a fairly simple farm that uses random ticks in order to grow it downwards, but then it also uses a dispenser over here in order to start a new propagule, so it does use some bone meal. Like the other plant farms, it can be composted, but it's quite wasteful because it already uses some bone meal to grow it. But these propagule themselves, besides decoration, they do act like flowers, so they can be used with bees or used for pollen. They're also a sapling, so you can get an infinite source of wood just by bone milling these up as they make the mangrove trees. And since they are considered to be a sapling, they can also be used as fuel in a furnace in order to cook stuff. But despite being such a useful item, later on we'll see that there is items that can do the same thing, but are actually cheaper to farm up. And I have block by block tutorials on many of these farms in their original videos. In 15th place is the cactus farm. These are one of the oldest automatic farms in Minecraft, as they just will naturally grow and break off. You don't have to have any redstone or moving parts. And they're a plant, so we can use them for composting, which is a great way to get bone meal. You can also have them be smelted down in order to produce green dye, as well as be used on camels in order to breed them, so you can get these really lovely babies. If you would like to use schematics in order to build them, I have provided each of those in their individual videos. Next up is the mushroom farm, as you can farm both red and brown together without them affecting each other. They do grow really slowly, so it's not really worth composting them, although you can. But they're mostly used by players in order to craft the fermented spider eye, which is the main ingredient used in creating negative effect potions. You can also grow them up in order to get their big forms, which you can use to collect the cool unique blocks. The brown mushrooms also put off a very small amount of light, but for builders they're mostly just used for decoration. Farming them is pretty straightforward. We just have water flow through and break them off, and all collected in a single storage. You can see how I fit all these individual farms into the spawn chunks with the world download in the description. In 13th place is the amethyst farm. Unlike most of the other farms, which can be built in your spawn chunks or in a place where you already have some chunk loaders, the amethyst farm has to be built at a geolocation. That's because the budding amethyst cannot actually be moved, so you might get lucky in having one of these in your spawn chunks, otherwise you just have to chunk load it. Now, one of the main things you can do with the shards is make these blocks of amethyst, which look really nice. You could also craft some other items with it, but it could also be used in order to clone a lace and also trim armor. The farms themselves have to be custom designed around the actual amethyst in order to get the most amethyst clusters, but the collection system is quite simple. Next is the copper oxidizing farm. This machine makes it easier to oxidize large amounts of copper all at once, but it doesn't actually farm any new items, as you have to put in your own copper, but the actual random ticking of the copper blocks, converting them down to more oxidized version, no longer needs the player to be nearby. Now, the machine can also remove oxidization from copper. It can also automatically wax copper as well as remove wax from copper. And once it's done, it will automatically blow up the blocks and then store them down in a chest over here so that you can collect them to do all your copper needs. Because copper has so many different uses, this machine is actually pretty useful despite it being kind of complicated. And despite this actually being a semi-playerless farm, meaning that the player does need to be eventually here in order to operate it, because copper converts over so slowly, I decided to include it, unlike the other types of semi-playerless farms like vines and ice, which also are getting random tick, but because they are often much faster, they typically need the player always there to operate them. Designing farms takes hundreds of hours, so consider joining as a YouTube member. We're currently halfway, as 11th place goes to the beet farm. Beets are not too useful in the game. The beet farm produces not only the beetroot, also the beetroot seeds, and both of them can be composted. They can also be ate by the player, and they can even be turned down into red dye. They can also be used in order to breed pigs, as well as one of the few crops that you can breed villagers with, but they are great for trading villagers for emeralds. Now, in order to farm them automatically, we do need to have villagers, which is an extra entity that can create lag if you have them in large amounts, as they are pathfinding through here, harvesting all the different crops. Because beets need 2 different items and the villager could end up just getting clogged, we need to actually have a hopper minecart come underneath to pick up all the extra items, and then they deposit all their items into the chest. And like any of these farms, you can stack them and tile them as much as you want to get whatever rates you want, but just keep in mind every platform does need its own hopper minecart. But due to the limited uses of beetroot, it is the worst out of the 4 different crops that villagers can grow. In 10th place is the wheat farm, which is also very similar to the beet farm, where you can end up getting wheat as well as the wheat seeds. Like the other crops, both forms can also be composted for bone meal, used as villager food, as well as you could trade farmers in order to convert it into emeralds. It's also used in order to breed different cow types and sheep types, but also can be crafted into a variety of different items, including hay bales, which can be used in order to breed horses and llamas. In 9th place are potatoes. Like the other crops, they can also be composted, except for the poisonous version. They also work for breeding villagers, and you can trade them to get lots of emeralds. They work as food for breeding pigs, but they're also a really good food source for the player once you bake them up. The farm is a bit simpler than the beet and wheat farm, as we just have the villager come around picking up all the crops. They will fill up their inventory, and then once in a while they'll come over here and hand off their crops to these villagers over here, which have no food, but when they drop it, it just ends up coming over here into our storage. Now, we can also get poisonous potatoes from the farm, but in order for that to happen, we need to have a hopper minecart go underneath, as the villagers won't pick these up, and that's what the cart does, and then it will just put them over here in this chest. In 8th place is the carrot farm. They work great to compost down for bone meal. You can also use them for villager food, as well as trading them for infinite emerald source. Besides breeding pigs, you can also breed rabbits with carrots. Now, you can eat them as a food source, but they're not very helpful. But if you craft them into golden carrots, then they actually are one of the best food sources in the game. In 7th place is the wool farm. These are quite useful because they provide a lot of blocks, but also 16 different colors, which is great for building. You can also trade different colors for emeralds. This is also useful in isolating vibrations when it comes to skulk sensors, and isolating the lays from hearing other noises in non-stackable item sorters, and isolating the player's vibrations from wardens so you can easily loot the chest. And the wide variety of colors can be crafted into a wide variety of things. This is also one of the unusual farms, as it's not really a crop farm, yet grass uses random ticks in order to grow to new areas, and this is what makes a wool farm possible. Along with it, where you can now use shears and dispensers in order to shear them automatically, and I have some hopper minecarts picking up the wool, as well as another one resupplying the shears. Now, nether portals creating zombified piglins in the overworld is another thing that occurs with random ticks, but it's specifically coded to not occur without the player being nearby, so you cannot actually make a playerless gold farm using this. Villager breeder is in 6th place. Now, although you could build this before the update, it's now much easier, as before you'd have to use bees or dispensers to bone meal the crops in order for them to grow, and then these guys would harvest them automatically. But now they just grow naturally, and the farmer guy will harvest them, and then they'll breed, producing babies. This is a great way to stock all of your villagers in your villager hall. And since trading villagers is one of the best ways to get the most unique items in the game, this is why it ranks so high. We reached the final 5, so make sure you guys are still subscribed. In 5th place is the pumpkin farm. Not only does it farm up a useful block, but it also is one of Gordy's favorite blocks, as it can be sheared in order to turn it into a carved pumpkin, which you can put onto your face to get this crazy look and also stop endermen from attacking you. But also works as a great vegetation to compost down for bone meal, but is one of the best things to trade with farmers in order to get emeralds. Very similar to them, in 4th place is the melons. Both the slices as well as the whole ones can be composted. And since you can auto-craft the slices back into melon blocks, they're another great source in order to get emeralds. You can eat them, but they don't provide a lot of food. But they're more widely used to make glistening melon in order to do brewing. Because this farm can be used without having villagers, I rank it a little bit higher than the other crop farms. I have a few different style farms to harvest both the pumpkins and the melons. With this one here, it will come through and break them off and then collect the slices as well as the pumpkins with the hopper minecarts. Currently they are full because this farm has been picking up everything inside of spawn chunks. That's one thing to note, is that since these farms are typically running all the time, you can easily fill up your chest, so you might want to put in a little redstone system in order to automatically turn them off once the chest is full. And you can see all the items in the chest down below. We made it to the final 3 new playerless farms. In third place is the sugarcane farm, which could be used in order to compost down for bone meal, but its greatest use is when you craft it into paper, which not only is a great source of emeralds, but it's also used to craft a bunch of things, including one of the most used items when it comes to endgame, and that is firework rockets, which are used for elytras. And just like the melon and pumpkin farm, there's a few different versions of farms that are really simple, and this is why I ranked it so high. Even this big design here is actually quite simple, and it will give you an efficient supply of sugarcane. In second place is a kelp farm. It's a great source to have composted down into bone meal, but it's mostly used for its great use when it comes to smelting after you have dried it out and auto-crafted it into dry kelp blocks. And it can even provide its own fuel to smelt down the kelp, which produces a surplus of dried kelp blocks, meaning you got an infinite fuel source with this farm. And at any point you can always lock the hopper and then pull out one of the items in order to get all the XPs from this item and all previous items that went through the smoker, meaning it's an infinite XP farm that is running 24/7 in loaded chunks, so you never have to waste time actually killing mobs. And if you have any extra, you can convert them into emeralds with an expert butcher villager. Because it has so many uses, I ranked it in second place. Although kelp farms themselves are notorious for the amount of particles they produce, which can drop your frames down to nothing, but also produce a ton of items, which also drops the TPS of the server down. So this is definitely one you want to have an on and off switch on, and you might even want to run the farm more often, that way there's just less items getting moved about. But once it completes the round, then the TPS immediately goes back up, and as you can see, it does produce an insane amount of items. But since the entire kelp farm has to be built in water, it is a little bit more complicated to build, and that is why it doesn't rank any higher. In first place for the new playerless farms, and maybe even the best farm all around, is the bamboo farm. This is because the bamboo can be crafted into bamboo blocks, which then can be crafted into planks, making an infinite wood source without you ever having to chop down any trees. And it turns out that 1/5 of all the items in the game of Minecraft actually use wood in some form. So it is by far the most important farm in the game. Plus it's like an official wood type like all the others, meaning it has a wide variety of unique looking blocks. And in my video where I ranked the best fuel sources in the game of Minecraft, bamboo was one of the best because it can be crafted into ladders, which produces the most fuel for the wood, which is another way to get an infinite XP source. Plus the bamboo can be crafted into sticks, which is a great way to get emeralds from Fletcher villagers. But unlike other crops in the game, you can't actually compost it down to make bone meal. The farm itself is less complicated than the kelp farm, but can come in a couple different designs. This one here is the most efficient one, being the entire length of the spawn chunks, but doesn't produce as much frame lag or TPS drop as the kelp farm. But once again, we do have to pick up all the items using hopper minecarts, which get activated from here and sweep across. I also have a system underneath which can automatically craft them down into the blocks and craft them down into the actual planks. The only downside to this farm is that it does need light in order to grow. Make sure to build this farm above anything else so it can have sky access. That way it can grow in daytime as well as nighttime without having any torches. Now see the other 30 farms that still work without a player nearby in this video here. Or check out this playlist on how I designed an automatic farm for every single item in the game of Minecraft. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!